June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The banks of the Bug River, occupied Poland. General Oberst Heinz Guderian stands atop his command vehicle, the sharp morning air biting at his face as the horizon ignites. The silence of the Polish countryside is shattered by the synchronized roar of 6,000 artillery pieces. It isn't just a barrage. It is the opening chord of a symphony intended to end the world of Bolshevism. As the Panzer Group 2 begins its lunge eastward, the mood in the German High Command is not one of anxiety, but of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. To Guderian and the architects of Fall Barbarossa, the Soviet Union is a house of cards. They believe that if they simply kick in the door, the entire rotten structure will collapse. The intelligence reports on their maps suggest a lumbering, decapitated giant, still reeling from Stalin's purges. The German generals expect a campaign of 6 to 8 weeks. They have prepared for a sprint, not a marathon. By midday, the reports flooding into the Wolf's Lair are staggering. The Luftwaffe has decimated the Soviet Air Force on the ground, claiming over 1,200 aircraft destroyed in a single morning. The frontier divisions of the Red Army are being bypassed and encircled by the lightning-fast pincers of the Wehrmacht. Near Brest-Litovsk, German soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division watch in awe as their armor rolls past burning T-26 tanks. The Soviet response is chaotic. Orders are contradictory, radios are silent, and entire regiments are vanishing into the kettles or Kesselschlachten being formed by the German pincer movements, like the war against Russia has been won in 14 days. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, writes in his diary. He isn't being hyperbolic. The numbers back him up. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers are being marched into captivity. Smolensk falls. The road to Moscow seems wide open, but as July turns to August, the dust of the Russian steppes begins to clog more than just the filters of the Maybach engines. Guderian notices a disturbing trend. At the Battle of Seno, his tankers encounter a new beast, the T-34. It shrugs off the shells of the standard 37mm door-knocker anti-tank guns like they are pebbles. More unsettling than the technology, however, is the math. German intelligence, the Fremde Heere Ost, had estimated the Soviets could field roughly 200 divisions. By August, the Germans have already identified 360. Every time a Soviet army is encircled and destroyed, another appears from the depths of the Eurasian landmass, seemingly out of thin air. These aren't just remnants. They are fresh formations, raw but resolute, armed with rifles produced in factories the Germans didn't even know existed. The German generals look at their maps, then at their thinning supply lines, and for the first time, a cold realization begins to settle in. They have killed the giant, yet the giant refuses to fall. Instead, it is growing. August 11th, 1941. The General Staff Headquarters at Mauerwald, East Prussia. General Franz Halder dips his pen into the inkwell, his hand trembling slightly as he stares at the latest reconnaissance overlays. The neat red circles representing Soviet divisions on his map have multiplied like a virus. We underestimated the Colossus, he scribbles in his private diary. At the start of the war, we reckoned on about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. If we destroy a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. While Guderian's Panzers refuel on the road to Roslavel, the Great Patriotic War is transitioning from a border skirmish into a total mobilization of a civilization. Behind the front lines, the Soviet Union is performing an industrial miracle that defies every German calculation. Under the direction of the State Defense Committee, GKO, entire cities are being dismantled. In a feat of brutal, desperate engineering, over 1,500 major factories, steel mills, tank works, and aircraft plants are being loaded onto flat cars. Millions of workers follow their machines into the Ural Mountains in Central Asia. In the open air, amidst the swirling dust of Chelyabinsk and Sverdlovsk, workers bolt together T-34 tanks and Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes while the factory walls are still being built around them. To the German OKH, Army High Command, this depth of industrial reserves is a ghost story they refuse to believe until the shells start hitting their lines. On the front, the German Lanzer, the common infantryman, notices a change in the air. The easy victories of June have evaporated. Near the Yelnya salient, the fighting takes on a primal, terrifying intensity. The Red Army isn't just defending. It is counterattacking with a reckless disregard for casualties that leaves the German veterans stunned. Captain Gerhard Münch of the 12th Panzer Division watches through his binoculars as a wave of Soviet infantry charges across an open wheat field near the Dnieper. They aren't retreating. They aren't surrendering. They are singing. "They come at us in blocks," Münch later remarks, "and our MG-34s mow them down like grass." But behind the first wave is a second and a third. The German Blitzkrieg relied on a psychological collapse, the shock and awe that shattered the French and Polish spirit. But the Soviet soldier, often poorly led and technically outmatched, possesses a grim, fatalistic endurance. When a Soviet unit is surrounded in a Kessel, they don't always raise the white flag. They dig in. They fight to the last bullet, forcing the Germans to peel back their armored spearheads to liquidate pockets of resistance, bleeding the Wehrmacht of precious fuel, time, and men. By late August, the German logistics chain is screaming. The Russian rail gauge is wider than the European standard, meaning every ton of supplies must be offloaded and reloaded at the border. The scorched earth policy of the retreating Soviets leaves the Germans with nothing but blackened fields and poisoned wells. As the sun begins to set earlier over the vast, undulating plains, the German generals realize they aren't just fighting an army. They are fighting a demographic tide. For every Russian soldier they kill, 2 more arrive from the Siberian hinterlands, wrapped in quilted Telegraika jackets, carrying the new PPSH-41 submachine guns. The House of Cards has turned into a fortress of iron. September 14, 1941. The outskirts of Kiev, Ukraine. The Kessel at Kiev is the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers are trapped in a pocket the size of a small European country. On paper, it is a triumph that should end the war. Generaloberst Franz Halder and the OKH celebrate what looks like the final blow to the Red Army's southern wing. But as the German infantry moves in to liquidate the pocket, the atmosphere is not one of victory, but of exhaustion. The German soldier, the Lanzer, is beginning to look like a ghost of the man who crossed the border in June. His uniform is tattered, his boots are wearing thin, and his eyes carry the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has seen the Russian steamroller firsthand. Despite the massive losses at Kiev, and the Soviet High Command, Stavka, does something the German planners deemed impossible. They simply create a new front. As the German panzers turn their noses toward Moscow for Operation Typhoon, the weather, the oldest ally of the Russian people, begins to shift. It isn't the snow that arrives first. It is the Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. The vast, unpaved Russian landscape transforms into a sea of viscous, waist-deep mud. The German supply columns, largely dependent on 600,000 horses and thin-wheeled Opel Blitz trucks, grind to a halt. The pride of the Wehrmacht, the lightning-fast Panzer divisions, are reduced to a crawl of 5 miles a day. Soldiers must literally heave their vehicles through the muck by hand. While the Germans struggle with physics, while the Soviets are mastering the art of the People's War. In the forests of Belarus and the marshes of the Bryansk, the first organized partisan units begin to emerge. These aren't just disorganized stragglers. They are coordinated groups blowing up rail lines, cutting telephone wires, and ambushing supply convoys. The German rear, once thought secure, is now a second front where every shadow hides a vengeful farmer with a Mosin-Nagant rifle. Back in Berlin, the intelligence reports are becoming surreal. Every week, the Germans identify new Soviet shock armies. Where are they coming from? The answer lies in the Trans-Siberian Railway. Stalin, gambling on intelligence from the spy Richard Sorge that the Japanese will not attack in the east, begins stripping his Siberian border of its elite, winter-hardened divisions. And these are not the raw recruits the Germans faced in June. These are men who live in the sub-zero tundra, equipped with white camouflage, skis, and the devastating Katyusha rocket launchers, the Stalin's organs, whose screaming flight sends a chill through the spine of even the most decorated German veteran. By October, the German generals realize the math of the war has fundamentally changed. They have killed millions, yet they are facing more enemies than they started with. The German war of annihilation has not broken the Soviet will. It has fused the Russian people and the Communist Party into a single, terrifying weapon of total resistance. The short stroll to Moscow has become a slog through a graveyard of German ambitions. December 2nd, 1941. Khimki, 11 miles from the Kremlin. Through his Zeiss binoculars, a German reconnaissance officer of the 258th Infantry Division can see the sunlight glinting off the gold onion domes of the Kremlin. It is the closest any unit of the Wehrmacht will ever get. The temperature has plummeted to minus 31 degrees Celsius, minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The German soldiers are wearing summer tunics supplemented by looted civilian scarves and newspapers stuffed into their boots. Their weapons are seizing. The bolt-action rifles must be kicked open, and the oil in the Panzer engines has the consistency of tar. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, once the ultimate optimist of the armored thrust, looks at his men and sees walking corpses. His tanks are stationary, frozen into the very earth they sought to conquer. But as the German offensive breathes its last, and gasping breath, the horizon to the east begins to tremble. It isn't the wind. It is the sound of thousands of fresh boots hitting the frozen crust of the earth. December 5th, 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive begins. The German generals are paralyzed with shock. Intelligence had assured Hitler that the Soviet reserves were exhausted, that the last battalion had already been thrown into the meat grinder. They were wrong. Out of the swirling white blizzard emerges the Siberian shock armies. These men are a different breed. Fresh, well-fed, and dressed in thick sheepskin coats and felt Valenki boots that defy the frost. Behind them rumbles the T-34, its wide tracks gliding over the snow that swallows the narrow-wheeled German Panzers. High above, the screaming Stalin's organs, Katyusha rockets, saturate German positions with high explosives, turning the frozen foxholes into icy graves. The enemy's strength was underestimated to a degree that is almost incomprehensible, General Halder notes, his previous bravado now replaced by a chilling dread. For the first time since 1939, the Wehrmacht is not just being slowed, it is being pushed back. The myth of German invincibility shatters in the snows outside Moscow. The Soviet colossus hasn't just survived the greatest invasion in human history. It has weaponized its own suffering. The German generals, who once plotted a 6-week victory march, now find themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. They had calculated for a war of territory, but the Red Army has forced them into a war of attrition, a game of numbers that Germany, and with its limited population and overstretched industry, simply cannot win. As the German retreat begins, the realization hits the high command like a physical blow. They have woken a giant that will not stop until it reaches the ruins of Berlin. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to watch them every day.